high quality diet. So this was a diet that's more rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and fish was one of the main protein sources they were looking at, or low quality. And those eating 100 grams of unprocessed red meat per day was associated with a 93% higher risk of ischemic heart disease amongst those with the highest diet quality. Yeah, it was basically almost double the risk. Enterolactone. So this is a breakdown product of lignans, which are found in flax seeds, being one of the major sources of that. The reason it's such a good marker is that we don't make it. The only reason it's in your body is because you ate it or you consumed something was broken down into it. There was a 30% lower risk of all-cause mortality and a 45% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality when comparing high levels to low levels. That's crazy. And again, the only reason that's there is because you ate these foods.
Welcome back to another episode of The Proof. I'm Simon Hill, your show host, and today's guest is Dr. Matthew Nagra. If you're a regular listener, you'll be well aware of Dr. Nagra. He's been on the show a handful of times now, bringing clarity to topics such as plant protein and soy foods. Dr. Nagra is a naturopathic doctor devoted to helping people better understand what healthy nutrition looks like, both on social media and in his clinic in Vancouver, Canada. Are plants trying to kill us? Is Dr. Nagra biased? Is there a single optimal diet? Does eating fat make you fat? Do phytates rob our bodies of minerals? Should we all avoid gluten? Is a low-fat plant-based diet the best way to do a plant-based diet? We discuss all of this and plenty more. Before we get into the episode, a quick reminder to please subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or whatever platform you're tuning in from. Your support is greatly appreciated and enormously important to this show finding its way into the ears of more people. And now, my conversation with Dr. Matthew Nagra. How was the workout at Gold's this morning?
It was good. It's cool. I've wanted to go there for ages.
Was it first time?
First time. Well, yesterday was the first time. Today was
bigger than you thought?
Yeah, I heard that whole front open area is brand new or something. So that's definitely added. But I'd really only seen videos of that back blue wall, that famous one from the Game Changers and all of that.
We got a photo there.
Yeah.
For the memory bank. We're going to get into some cool stuff. And you've been on the show 2 or 3 times?
5 times, I think.
5 times. So, most people know who you are. And there was phenomenal feedback from those episodes. People were really, really appreciative of everything that you came on and shared, and all the great work that you do on social media, clearing up a lot of confusion.
Well, that's the goal, yeah.
Busting a lot of myths. And I'm actually interested, though, before we get into some of these different topics, I get asked a lot on emails and DMs from people who are kind of aspiring to get to a position like you are, where you're helping patients, but you're also online communicating science and looking through a very evidence-based lens. What can you share, I guess, with regards to your journey and sort of the events that have unfolded that have led you to that position that you're in now?
I think it really started with my personal health journey. And when I was, 14, I was, struggling with asthma. I was overweight. Actually one point I had a really serious asthma attack. I had to be put on oxygen and I was kept in the office for I think over an hour and a half, something like that. And, it was once I started to shift my nutrition that, I started losing weight. I started breathing easier, whether that was connected or not. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of debate around that, but that's what led me to wanting to dive further into nutrition. And then within a year, my dad had a cardiovascular issue and it's a minor, if you can call it, heart attack. And he also in the years following was really confused about nutrition and what to do. And he started working with someone who really dove into that topic and helped him change a lot of it. I think I helped a lot too on the way as I started to learn more. And since he's turned that around, he's improved all his biomarkers. He feels better than ever. The anxiety he had around his health is largely dissipated. And so as I went through school, I had the goal of wanting to help others kind of do the same thing and improve their health. And now fast forward, 7, 8, 9 years. And we're in a place where it's not just the people one-on-one that you're helping. It's all of these messages that you get, that I get, the comments, from people confused online about this stuff. And I find that if we're able to disseminate this information to them, maybe we're able to help, a large number of individuals, maybe not, again, in that one-on-one context, but at least help tease through some of the misinformation and provide some clarity for them. And so that's really the goal, is just to help with that sort of confusion that I once had and my dad once had.
And you studied naturopathy, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And I actually, in undergrad prior, I got a bachelor's in microbiology where I also studied some nutrition.
Okay. What's the difference between naturopathy or naturopathic medicine and sort of allopathic, I guess, maybe conventional Western medicine, it's often described as? What would the main differences be between those?
I think that does depend a little bit on where you are. So depending on, province to province, state to state, there are different sort of regulations. In North America, anyway, the education is largely the same. And the first couple of years probably mimic a lot of what you would learn in conventional medicine. I actually had some people I went to school with who were medical doctors and then went that route. And they did say there was a lot of similarity in the basic sciences, the chemistry, biochemistry, biology, etc. Where there are some differences is we do learn about pharmaceutical therapy. I do prescribe. I know that's a common misconception that we're like anti-medicine or something. That's not the case. Perhaps not as in-depth as they do. We can't prescribe everything that they do. We also don't have as much training in emergency medicine. Yes, we can do things like CPR and whatnot if needed, but certainly don't work in an ER. But where other differences come in is we do have a lot more of a focus on nutrition. We learn some other modalities like physical therapies, actually. So I do work with people with injuries, and I know you have a physiotherapy background as well. And then even some, nutraceutical supplementation, herbal supplements and whatnot as well. I'm not super convinced on a lot of the evidence around that stuff personally, but I think there's actually a lot more similarities than most people realize, at least from the accredited schools, where there are, of course, some differences in the mentality around it and what sort of treatments we learn more about.
We're going to go through a bunch of different claims, and maybe I'll do this in a sort of true or false way, and we can step through them and you can help us unpack them. But before we kind of get to those at a high level, why do you think there is so much confusion? Why do you think that the average person would, or do you think the average person would find it difficult to determine what a healthy diet is?
I think, especially with social media, the access to information is so broad at this point. Everybody has access, and anybody can be an expert. And we have podcasts with millions upon millions of followers who are listening to a lot of the information being put out there. And I think it's just that you have people with certain beliefs, whether that's because they adopted a certain dietary pattern and improved their health in some way, or at least subjectively, like in the short term, improve their health in some way, and they then believe that's the answer. And I can understand that to a degree. I feel like I had that early on as well. Of course, now I'd say I'm much more objective in the way I evaluate research, but it's compelling when you make a change and you feel so much better. And then you hear from others that they've experienced the same thing, and you want to believe that this is the way, so to speak. I think that's really it. You have individuals like that with large platforms, preaching their stories. They're great storytellers, a lot of them. And then others who maybe have had a similar experience or tried something that they recommend, felt better, they'll, of course, believe it, or then the next day they hear conflicting information and then they're confused again. But I think that's sort of where it comes from.
We can get a bit lost in our N=1 anecdote.
Yeah.
And forget that that's uncontrolled and not necessarily the same result. Well, two things. One is we may be attributing our result to the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And secondly, the result that we got from whatever we did may not be something that's replicated for everyone else.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what the research is for.
Have you heard of Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yeah. Yeah, just kind of people tend to or they think they know more than they do. And
particularly at the beginning when
yes,
you learn something.
yes.
So there's a very steep learning curve at the beginning of delving into a new topic. And in that early phase, you can sort of become overconfident.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for.
And so your confidence actually never returns to that level. Even as you study for years and years and decades, often the people that are dedicated and continue studying start to realize how much they don't know, and then humility sort of comes in. And even though they're actually gaining more knowledge over the years, their level of confidence and how they talk about that topic doesn't get back to that very initial mountain of confidence that they reached.
Well, yeah, you get I get these comments, I know you do too, where people say like, this is wrong or this is that, or they're very direct and very confident in their claim. But then you hear an expert talking about, you had Mark Messina on the other day, or at least I listened to it the other day, and he's talking about like, this may be something, or we don't quite know at this level of exposure what the result is, or it's that more cautious sort of language that I don't think we see when you're first learning about the topic and you become, overconfident in your position.
You mentioned beliefs, and one of the true or false statements that I have for you is Dr. Matthew Nagra is a biased vegan, and you also mentioned before being objective. So true or false, is Dr. Matthew Nagra a biased vegan?
I would say, yes, I have a bias because I am vegan. I would prefer that we didn't use animals for, the purposes that we do. But does that mean that affects my objectivity when it comes to talking about the literature? I don't think so. I can look you straight in the face and say that fish is a health food, that low-fat dairy can certainly be a regular part of a healthy diet, that small amounts of red meat aren't going to hurt you. But when it comes to the environment or ethics, I think that is problematic, and I can be honest about that too. But where I really think it's sort of ironic is I tend to see more bias in people who claim to not have a bias. And I've seen that a lot. There's a lot of people online who kind of hide behind this, I'm not biased because I'm an omnivore. I eat meat, I eat plants. I don't, I'm not in the keto camp or carnivore camp. I'm not in the vegan camp. To claim that you don't have a bias, I don't think anybody is totally free of bias. I think everybody has a bias. We all eat. We all have to eat. We all enjoy certain things.
If you're sitting there and you're thinking, I'm not affected by any sort of bias, you're probably very much affected.
Exactly. And, I would just have to ask this individual, what's your favorite food? I can just ask something broad and they might say, a nice ribeye or something. Well, so you enjoy eating meat, or perhaps it's on the plant-based side, so you enjoy eating that. The fact that you get enjoyment out of that means that there's probably some level of bias there. And to claim others are biased but not recognize your own bias actually has a term. It's called the bias blind spot. And that's something that comes out a lot. I get called biased all the time by people who claim to be free of bias. And I think that is just really shining through in those cases. But I think you have to recognize your bias first before you can even set it aside and address it.
Right.
So I go I try to go that extra mile of like, am I looking at this through a biased lens or not? How can I be objective about this? Whereas if you don't even realize you have a bias, how do you do that?
Right. We're much better off if objectivity is the goal. We're much better off if our biases are operating within the window of awareness, not outside of.
Exactly.
And you'd be familiar with Melanie Joy's work on looking at, often you hear veganism, it's an ideology. Yeah. And it's almost said as if it's the only food ideology, right? But her work sort of puts forward the fact that actually the dominant food ideology is called carnism. And one of the sort of interesting, facts about that ideology is that it is mostly invincible because it is the dominant ideology. So it's not really questioning. If you follow that ideology, because it's not challenging or questioning something, because it's accepted as the norm, most people are not aware that it even exists.
Yeah, that I would 100% agree.
Okay, so you're saying that you do have a bias, but when you review the evidence, you're aware of that. So talk us through your process. So when you go and look at nutrition evidence, what are you doing to keep that bias in check?
So I try to review any piece of literature, whether it is something, based on the title or abstract appears to be pro my position or anti my position. I try to just review it all the same. I'll go through the methods section, say, okay, how did they conduct this study? What are, potential concerns? How did they track food, intake, for example? Did they do it sequentially, every, like the nurses' health study and health professionals follow up every 4 years?
So you don't just say, they use the Food Frequency Questionnaire. This study is garbage.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm looking at how did they do it? What covariates? Like, did they look at exercise, smoking, etc.? Then what are the results? Is there anything that conflicts with our pre-existing knowledge on the topic? If so, why might that be? Try to figure it out. I think that's another thing that gets thrown out there, and maybe this is sort of a tangent, but people will say, well, there's conflicting information all over the place. We have one study saying this, another one saying that. When in 99% of the cases, you can explain it through, the type of adjustments they made, through the type of population you're looking at, where they may be a sick population or healthy population, how long the follow-up was. What is the difference in meat intake? For example, if people will cite data out of somewhere in Asia, saying, look, high red meat consumption was not associated with cardiovascular disease. Well, they ate like a piece of meat every 2 weeks.
Right. So high and low were all very low.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's explanations for these things, for these differences between the findings that are pretty explainable.
There's explanations that are pretty explainable if you're trained. And I think one of the problems with food is that because we all eat 3, 4, 5 times a day, we feel like we're an expert.
Yeah.
But I would say, a lot of people that are putting out information about nutrition are not always equipped with those skills of going through the research at that level.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The other thing that is important, you may have mentioned this, is converging lines of evidence and the evidence hierarchy. What is the strength of that data? And are you seeing different types of study all pointing into the same direction? Yeah,
I agree. That's another thing, especially with LDL cholesterol, and I know ApoB, as you discussed with Dr. Dayspring, being a better marker.
What a guy.
Yeah. It was entertaining. It was an entertaining listen.
I love the bit where he started talking about going down into the intestine and interviewing cholesterol.
Yeah, and you can tell he's been at it for a while with how he's able to just pull stuff from textbooks he'd written decades ago. It's like, oh man,
he's a classic.
Yeah, he's done a lot of stuff. But like, just going back to what we were saying there is that the converging lines of evidence. We have animal models, we have human data with randomized controlled trials using all sorts of different classes of medication and diet, all showing that you reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease by lowering LDL, and how much you lower your LDL cholesterol determines how much you lower risk. There's just no way that's due to other factors.
And even with that evidence, I think we also have to accept that evidence will not be perfect.
Exactly, yeah.
And a lot of this is looking at, okay, what's the alternative hypothesis and what's more likely based on the imperfect evidence that we have across different levels.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, speaking of alternate hypotheses, true or false? Plants are trying to kill you.
I'd say false, because if that's the case, they're doing a pretty bad job.
Did I do a good impersonation?
I'd say pretty good. Mind you, I haven't listened to quite as much of the content as you have, so maybe it's not burned into my memory as well. But yeah, I mean, obviously you're talking about Anthony Chaffee. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And his view on polyphenols and phytochemicals trying to kill us. And a lot of that stems from this paper by Bruce Ames. This was a paper from 1990, and in that paper they determined that it's in the title of the paper, 99.99% of the pesticides that we're exposed to, these things that are meant to kill insects and pests, are naturally found in the foods that we eat, largely in plant foods. And now his conclusion, Chaffee's conclusion from that, is that, these plants are trying to kill us because they're full of all these natural chemicals like the polyphenols and whatnot. But there are, several issues with that. For starters, in that paper, they explicitly say that fruits and vegetables are healthy. They say that they're consistently associated with great health outcomes. And their ultimate conclusion, in fact, this is right in the abstract of that paper, is that because most of our exposure to these potential pesticide-like compounds are naturally in foods that are actually healthy for us, then the synthetic pesticides that make up this tiny fraction of what we're exposed to probably aren't a problem. So it's actually arguing that these chemicals broadly are probably not an issue for us, yet it gets spun into this concern around those chemicals that are naturally found being toxic or harming us. And there are so many issues with that sort of conclusion, because that's largely based on like cell culture studies or rodent studies, or again, looking at the impact on insects, which is essentially what they're
and
trying
also
to protect against.
where the exposure on a milligram per
Is
kilogram
very
basis
high.
is not something that humans would be exposed to through diet.
Yeah, exactly. We would not be consuming anywhere near that amount. And again, the foods are health promoting. But what's really interesting is that polyphenol consumption, whether it's from things like coffee, tea, fruits, vegetables, is very consistently associated with great health outcomes, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, lower risk of total mortality. This is what we need to look at, the actual health outcomes in humans. And in fact, there's some really, really strong data on a particular metabolite of a polyphenol called enterolactone. So this is a breakdown product of lignans, which are found in flax seeds, being one of the major sources of that. And the reason it's such a good marker is that we don't make it. The only reason it's in your body is because you ate it or you consumed something that was broken down into it. And highest consumption in this meta-analysis of studies looking at levels found that there was a 30% lower risk of all-cause mortality and a 45% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality when comparing high levels to low levels. That's crazy. And again, the only reason that's there is because you ate these foods, not because you're genetically producing more or something, because we don't produce it.
Higher polyphenol intakes also being consistently associated with lower risk of Alzheimer's, dementia as well.
Yeah, and there's some really cool studies on like berry consumption, whatnot, improving some markers of cognitive function.
Even clinical trials.
Yeah, exactly. Not necessarily as it relates to Alzheimer's, but even just
acute.
In the short term.
Yeah, I printed out that paper because I thought it would come up, and just to kind of emphasize what you said, here's a direct quote from the AIMS paper. Yeah. Caution is necessary in interpreting the implications of the occurrence in the diet of natural pesticides that are rodent carcinogens. It is not argued here that these dietary exposures are necessarily of much relevance to human cancer. Indeed, a diet rich in fruit and vegetables is associated with lower cancer rates.
Has that ever been quoted?
That was conveniently left out, as was, I will say, and the reason I said plants are trying to kill you in that kind of fashion, I certainly wasn't mocking Anthony Chaffee. It's a video that's gone viral. It's titled "Plants Are Trying to Kill You," and it has, I think, 500 or 550,000 views by this stage. And something else within that, so Dr. Chaffee cites the AIMS paper and leaves out that critical information that we just went over, which is the dose, how much are you exposed to through diet, and also what the main takeaway from the paper was. And he also cited the World Health Organization's website, where they talk about natural plant toxins. And he used this as evidence to say, see, even the World Health Organization are aware of this. But he left out, again, a very important paragraph from that page that he shared that says, in a usual balanced diet, the levels of natural toxins are well below the threshold for acute and chronic toxicity, which I think is important.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, all of the fact that these points are being left out, but he's aware of these papers is also like questionable as far as like, is he just, purposely leaving this stuff out, or what's, I don't know. It's upsetting, to think about it that way.
Yeah, it seems like he's had an anecdotal experience and seen other anecdotal experiences. Maybe you can comment on this, why someone who adopts he only eats meat and water, but why someone who adopts a diet like that might experience some benefits. To me, it seems like he's trying to attribute that to the removal of of toxins, but there could be many other reasons. Is that something that you've thought about?
Yeah. So he's like, when you're removing basically everything, from your diet except the meat, and certainly removing ultra processed foods if you were having any, it's kind of expected that if something was bothering you and you remove it, you might feel better as far as your gut function. Maybe you had some like IBS-like symptoms and you remove some foods that you're having problems digesting. That could be something. If you're eating a really heavily, processed food, it's possible that, the meat's going to be a lot more nutritious than probably some of that stuff too. Maybe you were running into issues that way. I don't know what his history was in particular, but there are plausible explanations for why someone might feel better in the short term. At the same time, that doesn't mean it's going to be great in the long term. And I think that's where there's an issue. We can look at a lot of things, smoking being one, where people can actually feel better in the short term. It might calm their nerves. It can help with weight loss. It can do all of these things that in another context might be viewed as good, but we know based on all the data, epidemiological or observational data, I should clarify, that smoking, leads to high risk of lung cancer, total mortality, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. So I think we're focusing too much on these short-term changes, which it's great that somebody has improved in that way, but while forgetting about or trying to make excuses for why it won't be a problem in the long term.
Right. And also overlooking that there are protocols that have been tested to help someone who perhaps does have food intolerances settle symptoms, and then through a sort of reintroduction and challenging protocol, establish which ones are causing some issues that they're intolerant to, which ones are not, and then reintroducing foods they can tolerate to increase compounds like fiber that we know are associated with good long-term health.
Yeah, absolutely. There's obviously like low FODMAP diet. There's all sorts of other elimination diets that have been more well characterized, and someone can work with a professional to walk them through that.
The other thing that I always think about with this idea that plants are trying to kill us is that, and in that video, Dr. Chafee goes on to sort of insinuate that he thinks the cardiometabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes and obesity, etc., are being caused by these compounds in foods like broccoli and Brussels sprouts. And he names those foods and others. Going back to our alternative hypotheses, I think there's much stronger hypotheses that exist to explain why there are so many cardiometabolic conditions. But just on the notion that you can blame these foods for type 2 diabetes and obesity seems ludicrous, given the actual average intake of these foods across population is negligible.
Yeah. And when you think about, especially naming some of those diseases like type 2 diabetes, where it's like, in the US, again, I'm Canadian, but I think in the US, it's coming up to half of the population has diabetes or type 2 diabetes or prediabetes or something in that ballpark at this point. Are half of them overeating broccoli and Brussels sprouts and, those types of foods? I don't think so. I think it's much more plausible that they're eating the McDonald's and the, that sort of stuff.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off. Next, true or false? Unprocessed red meats do not increase risk of cancer or cardiovascular disease. That is old science.
I would say false based on the best available evidence. Now, where that often stems from is there's this Canadian study, the Alberta Project or Tomorrow Alberta Project, something along those lines, where they looked at red meat intake and they separated processed and unprocessed red meat, which is great. I think most studies should do that. And then they looked at what does a high versus low red meat intake do to cancer risk, whether you're eating low, moderate, or high fruit and vegetable diet or intake. And they found that in the higher red meat intake, or in those eating the most red meat while also eating the most fruits and vegetables, there was not a statistically significant increase in risk of either all cancers combined or a combination of 15 specific cancers that they were looking at. They weren't looking at individual cancers though. And since there wasn't a significant increase in risk, some people will claim that, well, there's no risk, right? There's just no risk to eating unprocessed red meat in the context of a fruit and veg or fiber-rich diet. And there are like several layers of issues with that. For one, claiming that there's no risk isn't really accurate, because all that means is that the result wasn't statistically significant one way or another, right? When we get a result from a study, let's say, as I just cited with the enterolactone, 30% lower risk of all-cause mortality, that was sort of the average finding from that collection of studies in the meta-analysis, but there's a range, a confidence interval that's given. So the true value could be higher or lower. There's a range there. If that range covers no risk, then we say it isn't statistically significant. And so just on a technical level, saying there's no risk isn't quite accurate. There could still be, there could not be. It just wasn't detected in that study. But some bigger issues are that, well, in those eating the most red meat, when you compare them to those eating the least red meat, we're talking about 2.5 servings or so a week. And where we most consistently see an increase in risk of certain cancers like colorectal cancer is around 100 to 150 grams per day, right? So a big difference. We're talking a serving plus per day, not just 2 or 3 per week. On that note, this was looking at a combination of cancers. It wasn't looking at the cancers that are most consistently associated with red meat consumption. That would be like colorectal cancer being one of the primary ones. So what if it's the case that red meat did increase colorectal cancer, but then fruit and vegetables lowered risk of other cancers? Then your overall result is going to be null. It's not going to appear like there's much risk there. And so there's those issues. And then at the same time, it's only talking about cancer. What about cardiovascular disease, the number one killer, or other issues? Why are we saying that there's no risk when it wasn't even looking at other health outcomes? And when we look at research on that topic, so there was one study I know we've discussed previously where they stratified diet into a high quality diet. So this was a diet that's more rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and fish was one of the main protein sources they were looking at, or low quality, low diet quality. And those eating 100 grams of unprocessed red meat per day was associated with a 93% higher risk of ischemic heart disease amongst those with the highest diet quality. Now, again, talking about the confidence intervals like I had mentioned.
93%.
Yeah, it was basically almost double the risk. But the confidence interval was quite wide, meaning the true risk could be lower than that. It could also be higher than that. But the fact of the matter was there was a significant increase in risk. So why are we ignoring that because of this one study on this collection of cancers that suggested there wasn't a significant increase in risk?
Well, because we like eating meat.
There you go. I think
the answer to that's pretty simple.
But it's just like we have reason to believe, and this data is consistent. And even in the epidemiological, I got to start saying observational, because for those listening, epidemiology can encompass randomized controlled trials if they're looking at like disease outcomes and markers as well. But when we look at the observational research on red meat consumption, even unprocessed red meat consumption, it adjusts for fruit and vegetable intake most of the time or diet quality anyway. And so those factors are largely being considered in most of the research that we have on the topic. So there is just a lot of issues, and it just seems to me like that is largely bias playing into it.
What about the global burden of disease study, Dr. Nagra? Have you seen that?
Oh, you mean the burden of proof?
Burden of proof.
Yeah, I was like, global burden, I think, says red meat's a problem. Yeah,
that's right. No, burden of proof.
Yeah.
Wrong burden I got there.
Yeah.
But the paper that came out maybe 12 months ago, I think if someone was sitting here who was trying to argue the position of unprocessed red meat not being a problem, they would challenge you with that study.
Yeah, so this was a large analysis that came out, you said roughly a year ago. It might even be a bit less than that, but somewhere in the last year. And it was a meta-analysis, and they were looking at various outcomes. So one of the health outcomes was colorectal cancer, and they did find that 100 gram per day, again, that kind of threshold I was mentioning, was associated with a higher risk of colorectal cancer, statistically significant. So we should, I think, be taking from that there was still an increase in risk in colorectal cancer. But they did something really, I think, odd in their methodology, how they came to their conclusions about what is considered a weak association or no association or stronger association, is that, again, we have these confidence intervals, this range of values. They took essentially the bottom of that. So the result would have to be significant one direction or another. And then they took the very bottom, lowest possible value almost, not quite.
From the confidence interval.
From the
Can you explain to someone who's never heard of a confidence interval or an effect size, what is this?
So let's say we have a value. We'll just go, again, I can't recall the exact numbers, but I'm going to make them up for colorectal cancer. Let's say there was a 20% higher risk of colorectal cancer per 100 grams that you consume. Now, that will come with some sort of confidence interval, this range. So let's say the confidence interval was anywhere from like the 10% mark to 30% mark, just to make it easy. So 20% is right in the middle. That's what we're saying the value was that was found. And that tells us that, the true value is probably in that range. It doesn't mean that it's 20% right on. It could be less, it could be more. But if that is not crossing that no effect line, we can be confident that there is an effect. That's essentially what it means. I hope you think that's clear enough?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what they did is they took the bottom of that range of the possible values. And in the case of, say, colorectal cancer, it was statistically significant. So it was still suggesting an increase in risk, but they went further. They then made these cutoffs, these cutoff values. If that number, and again, I'm making these up because I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say if that bottom number wasn't at least, a 10% increase in risk, it's considered a weak association. It's probably not real, essentially. If it was above, 20%, 25%, then it's considered a moderate association. If it was above like 50%, think about that. The bottom of that effect, at least a 50% increase in risk to consider it a moderate effect. Somewhere in that range. Then, so for red meat and basically any health outcome, they were ranked like weak, essentially, as far as associations. And so they're written off as like no association. Well, no, that's like the lowest possible value, suggesting a small increase in risk, with the highest possible value increasing a much higher, or suggesting a much higher increase in risk. And the same thing applies to vegetables. They did the burden of proof study for vegetables as well. And almost every outcome was considered no or weak association. There was only one association that was moderate, and that was for type 2 diabetes. So why not apply that same logic to vegetables, if you're supporting, say, the burden of proof findings, and say, well, vegetables, they might help with type 2 diabetes, but they aren't going to help with anything else. It doesn't make sense to take one but not the other.
Right, you'd have to hold both views, which maybe some people.
Yeah, I think there's some people listening who do, but yeah.
Okay, well, someone's listening to this and thinking, just tell me what the safe amount of unprocessed red meat is. What can I eat each day or on average over a week where you think it would be a safe level of consumption? It's not increasing their risk of colorectal cancer, cardiovascular disease.
I think the safest level is probably, 0 can be one of those options, but I think up to about 2 servings a week, 200 gram or so servings per week.
Per week.
Yeah. And the reason is, so there was analysis by Zong. This was looking at 6 prospective cohorts in the US. Excellent adjustment model, great range of intake. So low intake was quite low. High intake was, at least close to that 100 gram a day mark. And they found in the dose response analysis that 2 servings per week did lead to a small increase in risk of mortality. So that's something to consider. And then we have research on the Adventist cohort as well, where they tend to have very low meat intake overall. And they found that when you consider like low meat intake to say no meat intake, there was roughly I can't remember the exact number, but a small increase in risk, again, around the 2 servings a week mark. So that seems to be, probably the cutoff for what I would say is totally safe, but then the risk isn't going to be great a little bit above that either. I think once you get into a serving per day is where you're most consistently seeing those associations.
So 200 grams that's one sort of fairly large serving a week.
Yeah.
Or average serving a week of a steak or something.
Yeah.
Do you ever get pushback on you just mentioned the Adventist studies.
Yeah.
Do you ever get pushback on Food Frequency Questionnaires? Are they reliable, Matt? Aren't they garbage?
So I do. I know we'll talk about it in a bit, but in the debate with Dr. Goodrich, that came up definitely. And I think there's kind of a misunderstanding of how they're conducted. So prior to using them in this research, they're validated. So what you'll do is you'll take a smaller group of individuals, you'll have them fill out the food frequency questionnaires, and you'll actually track their intake with, they could be weighted food records. So they actually weigh their food out and you have what they're eating at different points over an extended period of time. And you might even check with them, several months apart. And you'll see, does that food frequency questionnaire, the way that it's written, does it actually end up tracking your overall food intake in the long term?
Does it correlate?
Yeah, does it correlate well? So they do that. Another way that they started to do it now, and I think this is newer, but they'll look at blood levels of certain markers of intake. And so, blood levels of these different markers can correlate with intake. So you can't lie about that, right? You measure it, and you can kind of see how well the FFQ correlates with that as well. So these are validated instruments in most cases. Sometimes they use invalidated ones, and that's why you look at the methods section to see if it's validated or not. But if they're using a validated questionnaire, like, I wouldn't have too many qualms about it.
Tucker Goodrich, one of the two. True or false? Tucker Goodrich won the seed oil debate.
See, I think I'm extra biased in this case, but I don't think so. I would say false.
Can you tell people what this seed oil debate was or is for those who maybe haven't seen it?
Yeah, so just even backtracking to like what are seed oils for a second. So kind of your classic vegetable oils, the things like canola oil, sunflower oil, safflower, soybean, etc., corn oil, which was a funny point that came up during the debate about corn oil. But so we had, he's one of the people or faces behind this whole anti-seed oil movement. Thinks that, seed oils are the primary cause of most of our chronic diseases out there. He thinks if you eliminate them, you're pretty well safe, at least as far as my understanding is of most of the chronic diseases out there. And I reached out to him on Twitter one day and just said, hey, I have some, concerns with what you're saying. Would you be open to having a debate discussion about this? And then it took a while to get rolling. Eventually we made it happen. You hosted, and it was like a 4-hour marathon. We had bathroom breaks throughout. Like it was a long thing. It really got into the weeds at some points. But I think it was clear, and this sounded like the takeaway when you did a recap episode with Drew as well, was that I did have answers to pretty much everything he threw at me, and I had responses to it. I knew his citations pretty well too, and there were a lot of questions of mine that he was not able to answer, that he tried to dance around, and and some things even bit the bullet on, like he said that non-fatal heart attacks don't matter because seed oils in his own study were shown to protect against heart disease events, not necessarily cardiovascular mortality, because you just need larger, longer term studies to even detect that. But because it was beneficial for heart attacks as a whole, he said that non-fatal heart attacks don't matter, which I think is absurd of a position. Just stuff like that. There were just some things I think he could have just said, like, oh, maybe that is the case, or and we could have just left it there, but instead went the extra mile. And I think that's when you see kind of who won the debate, so to speak, is when you have these, very extreme positions being taken just to hold on to your, view and to hopefully come out on top, I guess.
Remind us of the bit on the corn oil that you just mentioned before.
So this was funny. So there was one study I cited throughout, because I think it's the best study we have on this topic. In fact, I would argue it's probably one of the best studies we have in nutrition, period.
This is one of the things that Tucker found difficult to reconcile.
Yeah. The LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. So a double-blind randomized controlled trial. People were living in an institution where they were randomized to one cafeteria or another. In the one cafeteria, they were having more of the saturated animal fats. In the other cafeteria, they removed the saturated fat.
They actually split them up, and they they were
randomized to different cafeterias. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So like, that everything in that cafeteria is one type, the other one's the other type, but they don't know what they're getting. And what they did in the seed oil one is they removed the saturated fat from a lot of the foods. So like they even had ice cream where they just like made it with like seed oils, or they took sausages where they somehow extracted the saturated fat and infused it with seed oils. So they're like going the extra mile. And they did a small study prior to make sure that they tasted the same and people couldn't tell. Like it's just crazy the amount of work that went into it. And so at the end, the seed oil group ended up having better outcomes. And he tried to criticize it, but I already knew a lot of his criticisms to this study in advance because I knew he'd come across it. And I had responses to every single one of his criticisms. So at one point when he didn't have any more criticisms, I just, I listed the oils that they were using, and one of the oils, so it wasn't the only one, but one of the 3 or 4 main oils they were using was corn oil. And he said that corn oil isn't a seed oil, which, I mean, technically it's a grain, I guess, but that is a seed, like whatever, we're getting technical there. The makeup of corn oil as far as its fat content is, identical or very similar to every other seed oil. And what's really ironic about that is that 2 of the 3 studies that he cited that he said were the best studies on the topic of seed oils were the Minnesota coronary experiment, where they used a corn oil margarine, and the rose corn oil study, literally in the title of the paper. And so I didn't catch him on it in that moment. I wish I did, but it was just so out of left field, this whole corn oil thing, that I didn't even think of that and put 2 and 2 together. But he's contradicting himself. If that's the case, that corn oil isn't relevant to the discussion, then 2 of his favorite studies are out the window.
Yeah,
so,
it's a logical inconsistency.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the takeaway point here for someone? Again, they're going into the grocery store and thinking about what they're going to cook their vegetables in or add to their recipe. Are they choosing corn oil, safflower oil, canola oil, olive oil, avocado oil, macadamia oil? How does someone navigate that?
So I would say you can't really go wrong with any of the ones that you mentioned. I would say the one, at least for blood lipids like LDL cholesterol, canola oil is probably the best. It's also the highest in omega-3 of the ones that you listed there. So that
has a pretty bad rap, though.
It has a terrible rap.
I think a lot of people hear canola and assume inflammatory, obesogenic, increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, that's the challenge. Is it has this bad rap, even though the health outcome data is completely on the other side. And in fact, there's not a single study that's ever shown that it increases inflammation. Not one. In fact, that goes for all seed oils.
From what I've seen, I think many people form that view or are convinced of that after hearing about how it's made.
Yeah, I agree. And it's the whole like processing nature, industrial nature of it, I guess. I mean, but that goes for so many foods that we eat. That goes for olive oil as well, in a lot of cases. And what I would say though, is if someone is truly confused, if they're not convinced by what I'm saying here, go for olive oil. You can't go wrong with that. And that's something that actually Tucker and I agreed on, was that olive oil is a good option. So if you want some level of agreement there.
And this is a good thing for us to underline. There were some agreements. I think that both parties would agree that consuming ultra-processed, highly palatable foods that contain seed oils is probably not a great idea. You two may differ in why those foods are deleterious for health. He might isolate and say, look, out of all of those ingredients in that food matrix, the artificial ingredients, the additives, the other fats, the refined sugars, all of these things, the fact that there's no fiber, he might still say it's the seed oils. Yeah. Whereas you would, and I'm sort of speaking for you, but I imagine you would say it's a culmination of many factors.
Yeah, and more than anything, you nailed it with the hyperpalatability. I think that's the number one factor, which can be contributed to by the high fat content and the sodium content and all that stuff as well.
But that's a little bit different to adding some canola oil to your cooking on your vegetables or some olive oil on a salad.
Yeah, that's not at all comparable.
Okay.
It's like actually an analogy I often use. It's like saying that water is deleterious to health because it's the main ingredient in Coca-Cola. Right? It's the package. It's not the water that's doing it.
True or false? Because a vegan diet requires vitamin B12 supplementation or the inclusion of vitamin B12 containing fortified foods, it's not natural and therefore it cannot be a healthy diet.
I'd say true, it's not natural. I'd say false to that means that it can't be a healthy diet. Just because something's natural doesn't mean it's healthy. Just because something's unnatural doesn't mean it's harmful. We can look at, we've talked a bit about red meat. I know there's debate around that, but that being one food that's like natural, but in with a certain level of exposure can be deleterious to health. For processed foods, we'll get into plant milks in a bit, I'm sure. Tofu we've already talked about. We did 2 full episodes on soy, and that's very health promoting food. And so this like kind of naturalistic fallacy, I think it drives a lot of people's, at least in the wellness space, their kind of decisions around foods and health. But really at the end of the day, it comes down to the health outcome data. Like, what does the research actually say about the impact of this on our health? And in that case, I mean, there are a lot of unnatural things that, could be quite healthy for us.
If you want to take that route,
Yeah.
then you kind of need to accept that you'll end up back living in a cave and maybe your life expectancy is only 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I mean, I know the question was specific to vegan diets too. Like, vegans consistently do better than meat eaters in most of the research out there, whether it's the Adventist studies, the EPIC studies, or whatever. There might be certain outcomes where the vegans do worse, and we can dive into some of those if you want. But generally speaking, when it comes to cardiovascular disease, mortality, et cetera, they tend to do better.
It's also not just vegans taking supplements.
Exactly.
And there are nutrient deficiencies that omnivores can be at increased risk of developing as well.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to be different nutrients.
Yeah.
So that's worth, I guess, pointing out.
Yeah, there was a great review from, I think it was in 2021, a systematic review of the studies published between 2000 and 2020. And it was looking at nutrient intake or status of, well, basically anything on a vegan, vegetarian, or omnivorous diet. And they had a fantastic chart in there where it highlighted nutrients that are at risk of inadequacy on a vegan diet, and then nutrients that are favorably high, things like fiber and magnesium, folate. And then you look at the same chart for the omnivores in that paper, and it's just kind of the opposite. It's like, so there are some nutrients the vegans are doing awesome with, but the meat eaters might need to worry about a little bit.
Yeah, like magnesium and folate.
And then there were some that there was overlap. All dietary groups were, had concerning intakes or levels of vitamin D. Same with iodine, and a few other nutrients as well.
So on the vegan side of that, just to kind of refresh everyone's memories, I know this is right in your wheelhouse. Someone sits down with you, they're newly adopting a plant-based diet. Let's say it's plant exclusive in this scenario. What are the sort of core nutrients of focus that you're bringing their attention to that they would either need to supplement or pay particular attention to certain food groups? Yeah,
so B12 is an obvious one. I think hopefully everyone's aware of that.
Are you on the cyanocobalamin or methylcobalamin?
I tend to favor cyano for a couple of reasons. For one, it's just cheaper and more widely available, it seems. You pick it up at like any pharmacy. And then it's more shelf stable, which is nice. And it's just the one that's been more well researched at this point. I don't think there's a problem with doing methyl or adenosine or whatever. I think they'll work as well. But I just tend to favor cyano because of yeast. And
you can always test your levels as well, and make sure that whatever you're taking is keeping you in the sort of normal or optimal part of the reference range.
Yeah, exactly. And then because, especially me being in Vancouver, we don't get a ton of sunshine year round, maybe a few months out of the summer, vitamin D is one that I tend to emphasize, whether supplementing or fortified foods. I'd say most of my patients end up supplementing with that. And then, or testing perhaps, if they're relying on fortified foods, we can always test that too. And then calcium is one that I think is only a concern if you're avoiding like fortified milks and whatnot. So I try to promote the consumption of fortified milks, a cup or two per day. That just helps add a bit of an insurance policy. If you're getting, say, 300 milligrams per cup, even a single cup adds quite a dent to your overall intake. But if you're not consuming fortified milks, if they don't like plant milks, and if there aren't other fortified foods available, then maybe considering a supplement for that.
What do you think the typical vegan would consume on a daily basis if they weren't supplementing with calcium, or they weren't getting a calcium fortified plant milk? Are we talking like 500, 600, 700 milligrams?
I think so. If you look at like some of the research on the EPIC Oxford cohort, for example, and these would be people who probably weren't eating much in the way of fortified foods, they're on average getting, I think it's around 550 or so milligrams. And I think that's reasonable. I think that's reasonable to get out of foods like tofu that isn't calcium set. We can't get that in Vancouver. I don't know if you're able to in Australia, but I know over in the UK it's more of a thing. But you can get a fair amount from tofu, some from other legumes, almonds, almond butters, broccoli, certain greens. But it's just nowhere near that huge dose you can get.
So you're trying to get people up more towards 1,000 milligrams?
At least 700. Well, I know that's the recommendation in the UK. I tend to favor 1,000 because let's have a safety net. But I would say like bare minimum, you want to get at least that 700.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so calcium, vitamin D, B12, iodine you mentioned before.
Yeah, iodine. So if they're using an iodized salt, then they could be covered if they're having about half a teaspoon or so per day. That, again, it depends on their intake. So I'll like go into detail on that, like how much are you using regularly in that. Otherwise, a supplement could be a reasonable option. Or for people with high blood pressure, provided they don't have kidney disease or other contraindications, you can actually use potassium-based salt alternative. So it's a potassium chloride instead of a sodium chloride, which can be better for your blood pressure as well. And you can get iodized versions of that.
Do you find when you're working with people who are new to this can all sound a little bit overwhelming?
I think it can, the way we're kind of talking about it here. But one thing that I will often kind of offer to them is like, look, we can do this multivitamin that just covers it all. and then you don't have to worry about it. And I think that's so easy. So that's another option. If you have a multi that covers the things like B12, D, iodine, and so on, if there's concerns around zinc or selenium potentially, depending on their diet and what they're eating, you can just get that in one pill per day. And that makes it so easy.
And there's not a problem with, I think there might be this idea out there, or I know there is, that consuming these synthetic supplements can't be good.
There are some people who come with concerns, but I ask them what their concerns are. And I'm fortunate that I have a lot of time to spend with my patients, especially on a first visit. We can spend up to an hour and I'll just go through, what are your concerns? And we'll go through them one by one. And usually by the end of that sort of educational period, they're on board. It's just, again, it's so easy to do. It's not worth the risks of falling short, especially on something like B12. And so usually they get on board. And the same thing goes for medications. I mean, I get people coming in who don't want to take statins, but their LDL's through the roof or something. And we'll have this sort of, one-on-one, like we'll spend half an hour on just the topic of like, what are your concerns about statins? And we'll, come to a conclusion where we're able to let's start with a low dose and see how you tolerate it. And then we can, consider upping the dose if we need to from there. And so I think it's all just education, but unfortunately, as we talked about earlier, when you're online, you're getting all sorts of conflicting information all over the place. Or if you're going to your doctor, in most cases, you don't have the time.
There's a lot of fear mongering,
yeah,
because that creates hype and clicks. And what's lost in all of that is that person on the end who just ends up totally confused and maybe makes a decision about their health that is not the best.
Yeah.
Even folic acid comes to mind there. What's your view? We mentioned folate. There's certainly a camp out there that are convinced that folic acid is increasing rates of cancer.
Yeah, I honestly don't even know where that comes from. I haven't seen good data suggesting it's causing cancer or anything like that. And it is actually really important for pregnancy outcomes. So if you're a female and of menstruating age and you're planning to become pregnant at some point, then that's definitely something to be taking and considering. And folate, you can get folate supplements as well, and they may do the same thing. But most of the research we have is on folic acid, so I just wouldn't mess around.
Right, folate's one of those nutrients we mentioned. If you're eating a vegan diet and it's full of whole foods, you're getting quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the things that in most of the studies comparing, again, meat eaters to vegans, the vegans tend to have double the intake at least. It tends to be really, really high.
You mentioned plant milks before.
Yeah.
This is not a plant milk.
Yeah.
But have you tried some?
I have not.
Have a sip.
Have a sip.
And this is not a sponsored post. Yeah, you have a sip and then I'll tell you what it is.
It's interesting.
Sorry, mate. That's the first cow's milk that you've had in a while.
Yeah, no.
Well, it's technically not cow's milk. It's a dairy protein.
Yeah. No, that was it's been 14 years since I've had dairy milk. So maybe I'm misremembering, but it does have that sort of texture, mate, or mouthfeel. It has
You're no longer vegan.
Yeah, right. I'm not vegan anymore, but it has that sort of mouthfeel that I kind of, it says animal free right on it. I think I'm good, but it has that mouthfeel that I kind of remember vaguely. It's interesting.
Right. So for anyone who's listening on the audio, Dr. Nagra just tried board cow?
Board cow.
Board cow. So this is not a sponsored post, by the way, although it did get sent to me, not for this purpose, but this is a new way of producing dairy milk through precision fermentation. I've had an episode on it previously, but in short, you can use microbes produce proteins, and providing whatever instructions they have will dictate the proteins that they produce. And there are ways to get those microbes to produce the same proteins that are found in dairy products, your favorite yogurt or cheese or milk. And so there's been enormous innovation in this area over a long time. And it dates back actually, and this is really interesting. So most insulin today that someone who has diabetes is using is insulin's a protein, or peptide protein, that is produced through precision fermentation. And historically, though, do you know how they got insulin?
It was isolated from animals, I think.
Right. I believe it was baby cows.
Yeah.
So they would have to slaughter baby cows to get the insulin. And then, of course, they realized from an ethical and a scalability point of view, they needed to come up with another means, and they worked out how to make insulin through precision fermentation. And then over the years, it's a technique that's been used to produce other types of protein that are found in cheese, actually, that people will have consumed before, rennet. And now there's a bunch of companies that are using it already with in-market products to offer, I guess, animal-free versions of milk and yogurt and ice cream.
Yeah, and this to note, it's because it's just the protein. It doesn't have any cholesterol. It's actually very low in saturated fat. I don't know what they use for the fat content, but
yeah, what would you say to someone who sort of pushes back and says, "Is that healthy?"
I mean, I would look for something like this. We don't have long-term health outcome data on proteins produced this way. Mind you, we have a lot of research on these proteins in other contexts, and I don't see a good reason to think that the protein itself would be detrimental in any way. And in fact, it could even be beneficial, just by increasing protein intake. The other thing I would look at is just the nutrient profile. That's what we do have information for. And I did look at the label earlier, and it, had, like I said, no cholesterol. It said 0 grams saturated fat. I think technically it's like less than 0.5, grams per serving or something like that. The sodium wasn't very high. It was like 140 milligrams. Like, from a health standpoint, I would consume that. I don't see any issue with that. I like soy milk better. I would probably keep doing that, but I wouldn't have any issue with drinking this.
Saturated fat, I've dedicated a bunch of episodes to this.
Yeah.
Dr. Jill Carvalho and I did a deep dive on sort of whether or not saturated fat is harmful and all of the intricacies of the research, things that you spoke about before. Like, what is the contrast when you're comparing high and low consumption, and what is the replacement food and whatnot? And we sort of walked people through all of that research to explain why the guidelines are what they are, which recommends to limit saturated fat. Not that it's poisonous, but the dose matters. So how do you help someone navigate that? If they say, I understand I need to moderate saturated fat, what does that mean? And if I'm reading labels or thinking about my diet, how do I ensure that my diet doesn't contain too much saturated fat?
Yeah, so if you're going by guidelines, which is typically to limit saturated fat to 10% of total calories or less, which translates to about 22 grams of saturated fat in a day, then reading labels can be helpful in that you just don't want to pass that on a given day. So if you're looking at a label and it's got like 2 or 3 grams of saturated fat per serving, that's not all that much. That's probably okay. If you're having like 7 servings, then it can certainly get up there. But that I wouldn't worry too much about. If it's 7 grams per serving, 10 grams per serving, then maybe you're a little bit more concerned that that's going to add up a third or a half of my target for the day or limit for the day. At the same time, if you're somebody who's at risk or you have elevated ApoB, then you might want to go even lower than that. And generally speaking, I would say the lower the better, as long as you're having a well-balanced, healthy, nutritionally adequate diet. Now, Outside of food labels, because not all foods have labels, the foods that are typically going to be higher in saturated fat are like fattier cuts of meat. So if you're doing like the extra lean meat, it'll be lower in saturated fat. Doesn't mean it's risk-free for other reasons, but generally the fattier cuts will be much higher. Butter is like very high. Coconut oil is very high. Some dairy products like the creams and full-fat milk might be concerning. Cheese seems to be more middle of the road. As far as its impact on lipids, just the saturated fat there. And then the one like true exception would be cocoa. So the saturated fat in chocolate seems to have a neutral effect on blood lipids. So to bring all of that back, basically reading labels, generally, a few grams or so per serving, I think is reasonable. Maybe up to 5 grams at most per serving is probably a reasonable target. And then as far as foods, the fattier cuts of meat, butter, creams, that sort of thing are the things to generally limit.
Right. It's one of the advantages of either eating predominantly whole plant foods or exclusively, providing, well, that actually rules out coconut oil and palm oil.
Yeah.
By virtue of it being minimally or unprocessed whole foods. But one of the advantages is you really don't have to count. It just naturally occurs that is a low saturated fat diet. But then people are, of course, interested in all of the new meat alternative products that are coming out. And some of those can be loaded with saturated fat, where they use a lot of coconut oil or palm oil. So that's something I think for people to keep an eye on. And I think your rule of 5 grams of saturated fat or less is a good one, and keeping an eye on your ApoB or LDL cholesterol levels. And then you can ascertain, is the current diet working for you or not? Or do you need to sort of titrate and change some of the foods?
Yeah, because there's genetic differences too. Like my ApoB is very low. I probably have a lot more leeway. Yeah, I know I'm lucky, but I mean, it's diet plus probably some genetics, right? But I probably have a lot more leeway than someone else might, or even you do, right? And so that's a good way to kind of figure out how much wiggle room do I have, is by just testing.
Right. What else on a label? If let's stick to these meat alternative products, and then maybe we can talk about plant milks separately. What else are you looking for to distinguish between a meat alternative that could be sort of less healthy versus one that is healthier?
So this is probably the hardest thing to find in kind of an appropriate or healthier range in a plant-based meat, but that's sodium. You know, if again, we're going back to guidelines, sodium intake is best limited to about 2,300 milligrams. And I think that's a fair target, especially when it comes to stroke risk. If you are someone who's at risk, who has high blood pressure, then even lower, around 1,500 milligrams. And for reference, the 2,300 milligrams is about a teaspoon of salt. And so if you're looking at some of these plant-based meat alternatives, they'll have 600 milligrams of sodium in a burger. I'll have 2 burgers, like that's going to add up really quick.
Makes them tasty.
Yeah. So, but that's another thing. It does make them tasty, but that can add up really quick. There are some alternatives I've seen. I can't recall specific brand names right now where it is more around the 200, 250 milligram mark. And I think that's a much better option from a sodium standpoint, especially for someone with high blood pressure. So that's another thing that I'm looking at is the sodium content.
If you look at saturated fat content, 5 grams or less, and then you look at sodium content, was it 300 milligrams or less?
I mean, again, these are ballpark figures. There's no hard line.
But those two things, before even looking at anything else, is knocking out. It's narrowing the field.
Yeah, it is big time. Yeah, it's really narrowing it. You're going to be stuck with like black bean burgers at that point, probably in a lot of cases.
Right. One of the other things I'd like to see is some fiber.
Yeah. I was going to say that's probably the next thing I would look at is fiber. And I don't know that I have a hard line for that either, because it depends on if you're eating a ton of fiber-rich foods in your diet, you're getting like 40, 50 grams of fiber. I don't think you need to worry about it. But if you are somebody like the average American, perhaps, who's getting very, very little fiber, every 4, 5, 6 grams matters. And in those cases, just looking for a higher fiber content, maybe not the 1 or 2 grams, but somewhere in the 4 or 5 grams might even make a difference.
Yeah, the context matters. I know a lot of athletes who find it actually helpful to have some of the lower fiber meat alternatives because they're already getting so much fiber into their diet and they're trying to meet their very high caloric requirements.
Yeah, and I think the same thing goes for kids. I think growing kids, like that's another thing, is their stomachs don't maybe stretch that much, right? And it's harder for them to get in the calories. And so either having some of that stuff that is at least mildly processed or including things like oils and whatnot can help bump up the calorie density a bit.
What about the idea that they're ultra processed?
Yeah. So like the thing about foods being ultra processed is, so it's largely based on this NOVA classification. And so there's a zone or a class 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is ultra processed. And so if you're taking a food that is made primarily of food ingredients or has a certain number of additives to them, they're going to be classified as ultra processed. Now that might sound really bad just based on how I've described it, but you think about fortified plant-based milks, they fall into that category. You can have a soy milk. You can make a homemade almond milk. Let's do that. Homemade almond milk, and you can add something like calcium to it to fortify it yourself, and all of a sudden it's ultra processed. Think about that. Does that mean it's bad for you? Probably not. We have food like tofu. Again, you do like a calcium set tofu or something. That's going to be considered ultra processed. So it's an imperfect system. It's way too simplistic. And there has been a lot of pushback on that classification lately because ultra processed foods can vary a lot. You can't sit there and tell me a Twinkie is going to be the same as tofu, right? And again, specifically like a calcium set or like a smoked tofu or something, which would be ultra processed. So yeah, I don't like the classification that much. I think as a general rule, limiting ultra processed foods is probably a good idea, but there is nuance there.
I love tofu, but I do wish tofu tasted like Twinkies. Yeah. I think a lot more people would eat it.
Enough. Well, we had tiramisu last night that was made with a tofu base.
Was it really?
Yeah.
That was great.
That was incredible.
Shout out to Aisha Shezai. Unbelievable cooking.
Oh man, I need that recipe.
Hospitality was incredible. Yeah. And great conversations.
Yeah, she must have, you can, I don't know if you want to show everyone a picture, but that spread, she must have been cooking all day.
We'll put something up on the YouTube for sure. Okay. The other thing that often comes up here is a sort of side-by-side comparison or maybe just a photo of the ultra-processed food ingredient list and the idea that simply because the ingredient list is long, that food must be unhealthy.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yeah. Oh, all the time.
You know what I'm talking about?
All the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time. And one of the examples I always use of that is, again, the plant-based milks, going back to that. So if you were to take a soy milk, for example, we'll say it's a fortified soy milk, it'll have like, the soybeans, the water, whatever, those would be some of the first ingredients. And then there might be, a couple emulsifying agents, some certain gums or whatnot. And then it's just nutrients. It's just like your calcium, your vitamin A, all your B vitamins, but they'll also use the scientific names for these things. So it'll be like calcium carbonate. They'll be like or tricalcium phosphate. It'll be
so
one
it
of the
sounds
two,
a little bit like something that you would make in a chemistry lab.
Exactly. You've got cyanocobalamin, you've got cholecalciferol, you've got all these names. They sound really complicated and scientific when really
those compounds are found in eggs.
Exactly. Exactly. These are just vitamins and minerals that they're adding. They actually make the food healthier, but because it doubles the size of that list, it makes it seem worse.
Are you worried about, are there any ingredients where you're like, I really don't want to see that in the ingredient list, whether it's refined sugars, there's a bunch of different names for what that could be. You mentioned gums, emulsifiers, carrageenan often comes up. Is there anything that you would, if a patient sort of sits down with you and says, okay, I understand the saturated fat and the sodium and try and find something with fiber. When I'm looking at the ingredient list, is there anything that I really don't want to see?
There's one that comes right to mind, but you won't really find it anymore. And that's partially hydrogenated oils. So that would have been one just because of the trans fat content that I wouldn't want in there. But otherwise, it all comes down to the amount. So you kind of have to like cross check the ingredients list with the nutrition facts label. Because let's say sugar you mentioned, if they're adding that and then you look at the label and it's like 2 grams or something, like who cares? It's not really anything. But if it's all of a sudden like 25 grams in a beverage that's a sugar sweetened beverage that's actually really not healthy to be having regularly, well then I'd be more concerned. But that's not necessarily based on the ingredients list. It's based on the kind of the amount and everything.
The ingredient list could be a clue if the first ingredient, which usually is the ingredient of greatest concentration or input amount.
Yeah, if it's like first or second ingredients, high fructose corn syrup, and then you look at the nutrition facts, it's like, 25, 30, 40 grams maybe even of sugar, then that's not great.
Okay, so is there a number of a kind of threshold of added sugars that you'd like to see it below on a per serve basis?
So for the most part, sugar seems to impact us negatively based on the amount that it adds to our, say excessive calorie intake. So that would come down to total calories. Are you eating calorie balance? That's going to depend. That's going to vary so much person to person. Where I generally would be mindful, especially if you're having it regularly, is if you're having a beverage with 20 plus grams of sugar in it. Because if you're having that kind of day in and out, that's something that actually appears to increase risk of things like cardiovascular disease, potentially diabetes and whatnot, independent of body weight, or at least some effects independent of body weight. And so that is one thing that I would be mindful of, but I don't know that I can set a hard number on it.
Okay. You already sort of gave us your views on seed oils. But they, of course, show up on these labels as well.
And the funny thing about that is, they'll often have sunflower oil or something. And then you look at the ingredients list and it's fat 0 grams. It doesn't even make sense. And that's because it's a tiny drop, basically. It's just to help with emulsification of the different ingredients in there. So it's basically not even in there.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned you want to see 200 or 300 milligrams of calcium, ideally in the plant milk. And your preference is soy?
I like soy.
Is that because of the protein content, or?
It's the protein, just nutritional content overall, even iron, a little bit better than some of the other ones. Not that I'm personally concerned about that, but just the protein content, the taste, texture, I just like it more. I know a lot of people prefer oat, and that's fine, but I just like the soy.
True or false? Phytates and oxalates in foods like oats and dark leafy greens rob your body of minerals.
That's a false.
Do you know where I got that from?
Yeah. Rob your body. That was from the same talk, wasn't it? No? Where was that from?
It's my friend Paul Saladino.
Oh, okay. Best buddy. So when you say they rob your body, that almost sounds like to people like it's removing it from your body stores of like taking calcium out of your bones or something. And even if we grant for a second that they bind to minerals, it's the minerals in the food that you're eating. So it's not that it would rob your body of them. It's that if anything, might reduce the amount that you absorb to a degree. Now, there are some other issues with that, let's start with phytates. So the main minerals that are often brought up with phytates are iron and zinc. Now, in the short term, if we were to look at a single meal study and you take people who are having, a high phytate food versus low phytate food, same iron content, you might see that the high phytate food leads to lower iron absorption. But what they don't look at is long-term intake. And there are at least 2 randomized controlled trials I'm aware of that looked at intake over 8 or more weeks. And when you randomize people to high or low phytate for that period of time, there's no significant differences in iron status at the end of that period. And so that tells us that the habitual intake, regularly consuming these foods, leads to some sort of balance as far as absorption goes. So if maybe in the beginning you don't absorb as much, your body somehow modifies that. And there's some speculation around the gut microbiome and how that might impact the interaction between phytates and minerals. I don't know if it's entirely clear on what happens, but the net result is that we see a similar level of iron absorption in the long run.
Right.
And with zinc, we don't have as much research, but there was one analysis of 8 studies done on children in particular. And they found that about a 500 milligram increase in phytate consumption, which I think is about a cup of cooked brown rice, so about half a cup raw. I think it's roughly around that, might have inhibited zinc absorption by 0.04 milligrams a day, nothing. And they ultimately conclude that there's just no major impact on absorption of zinc either. But again, we don't have as good data for zinc as we do for iron. But the point being that in the long run, we don't see really a negative effect. In fact, if we look at urinary phytate levels in women, and I think this was the Nurses' Health study, we see higher phytate levels are associated with better bone mineral density. So it's actually better outcomes. There's speculative evidence, if we were to look at, animal models or cell culture studies, that they might have anti-cancer or cardioprotective properties.
Decrease advanced glycation end products.
Exactly. So the same types of speculations that a lot of these people in the carnivore community can actually be used in favor of phytates versus against, but obviously they don't usually mention those.
That would make for some interesting content on social media.
Yeah, maybe I'll think about it for future here. And then for the other side, so for oxalates, so it's well known that oxalates bind to calcium. I think that's pretty well understood. And really the solution there is just don't focus on oxalate-rich foods for your main calcium sources. And that would be things like spinach, beets, Swiss chard being some of the main ones. And instead focus on other things like, we talked about fortified milks being a really awesome one. Even things like broccoli are pretty decent. Almond butters are decent.
Yeah, what are the lower oxalate grains?
So kale would be one that's low, which is funny because I've seen people like Dave Asprey call it a high oxalate. I actually made a post about this. It's in his book too, I think, saying that it's one of the main offenders as far as oxalates, but kale's actually very low in oxalates. You can take almost any green other than the three I mentioned, and they're pretty low in oxalates.
He has a kale buster supplement.
Yeah, I know. There's a kale buster.
Say no more.
Yeah. You and Drew talked about that on your episode. That was a funny one. But then with oxalates, it's really just don't eat those oxalate rich greens as your main calcium source. It's okay to have them, just don't focus on them.
Right. Okay, so we can put that one to rest. Phytates and oxalates are not going to rob your body of minerals. True or false? And you've already alluded to this, but I want you to answer it directly. There is a single optimal diet.
No, I don't think so. Or if there is, we haven't figured it out. What I would say is that there are characteristics of a healthy diet that can apply to multiple different healthy, dietary patterns. So things like, fruits, I would say roughly 2 or more servings a day. Vegetables, roughly 3 or more servings a day. Whole grains, ideally 3 or more. Some might even argue 5 or more per day. Legumes, or this is kind of an either or because different populations will use different foods as their protein sources, but either legumes or fish as some of your primary protein sources. And then nuts and seeds or oils or oils as your polyunsaturated fat sources, essential fats. Those are kind of the bases for what makes up a healthy diet. And you can fill it in with other things, but that applies to, say, the Mediterranean diet, DASH diet, portfolio. It can be a vegan diet or like a whole foods plant-based sort of diet, depending on the iteration. It's not one, diet.
So low saturated fat, it features unsaturated fats, It's high in fiber, low in ultra processed foods.
Exactly. As the foundation, and then you have wiggle room too. That's the other thing. You don't have to be like 100%, only healthy foods all the time. Like you can fill in gaps a little bit with other stuff. You can enjoy yourself. That's the other thing is we don't have good reason to believe that all of these less healthy foods, so to speak, are going to be detrimental in any serving size.
I wish we had another phrase for ultra processed foods, because even in what I just said then contradicts the idea that there are some ultra processed foods that you don't have to moderate that are actually healthy, and that it's such an umbrella term, and it, as you said, can be everything from what did you say, Twinkie to
soy
tofu.
milk or something, or tofu.
Right. We need another word to distinguish between those.
I don't know what it is. I feel like it's too ingrained at this point. It's used all the time.
I think we need to get the Nova Classification Committee back, get them back to the drawing board there.
Yeah.
Hey friends, are you ready to take your fermented food game and gut health to the next level? Look no further than my digital guide, Plant-Based Ferments. Inside, you'll discover some of my favorite recipes, including my soy labneh and homemade kombucha. Visit theproof.com/ferments for more details. That's theproof.com/ferments. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get back to the episode. True or false? Eating fat makes you fat.
It can if you eat it in excess calories, but I would say false as it was kind of stated there. Basically, eating excess calories, whether it's from carbs or from fat, is what leads to fat gain. And both high fat and high carb diets can lead to weight loss if eaten in a calorie deficit. And we've seen that in several studies now. So I think that's really just the kind of quick answer to that one.
When you adopt a keto diet, you burn more fat.
True. But where's that fat coming from? So there's this idea that when you're eating keto, because you're in a fat burning state, that you're burning your own fat. But that just comes down to calories. So if you're eating in a calorie deficit, if you're eating less calories than you need, whether it's on a ketogenic diet or otherwise, you're going to burn fat. If you're eating, let's say, at a weight stable amount, let's say you have 2,000 calories you're eating in a day. In one case, you're eating a ketogenic, very high fat diet. In the other case, you're eating a low fat, high carb diet, same amount of calories. The keto diet will burn more fat because they're putting more fat in. They're burning the fat, they're just burning the fat that they're eating. It's not necessarily burning the fat that they've stored. Whereas with the higher carb diet, they're burning the carbs that they're eating, not tapping into their fat or carb stores that way either. So I hope that's clear, unless you have another way to rephrase that.
No, I think that was great. I think it confuses people.
Yeah.
Right. The idea separating the fuel that you're using from the food you're eating versus body fat. So fat in the diet, and what you'll be using to generate energy versus body fat stores.
Yeah, they're two separate things.
Okay. A low carb ketogenic diet is the best diet for treating type 2 diabetes.
I would say false, with like the exception that some people might do better on it. So basically with type 2 diabetes, the main factor is going to be fat loss. So the main contributor to insulin resistance is going to be excess body fat accumulation, especially liver fat and pancreas fat. And so if you're able to lose fat, whether it's on a ketogenic diet or again, a higher carb diet, you can help improve insulin sensitivity, help prevent further damage to your pancreatic beta cells, and hopefully improve your condition and in some cases even avoid things like medication down the road. Now, if you're at a point, and we talked about this a bit previously, not in this conversation, but if you're in a case where the pancreas has been damaged and you're requiring insulin, it might be the case that somebody on a ketogenic diet will just require less insulin, perhaps. Maybe it's easier for them to maintain a healthy blood sugar because they don't have to be as on top of it. Whereas somebody with, say, a similar level of pancreatic beta cell function, eating a higher carb diet needs to modify their insulin dosage depending on how much they eat. If they're both managing that and on top of it, it doesn't matter. But in the case where maybe one individual is more on top of it than the other, that person who's not dosing appropriately or not monitoring as much, maybe perhaps would do a bit better. But that's very speculative and very dependent on the specific case.
Right. Yeah. So personalization and the management part being key. In my conversation with Thomas DeLauro, we were talking about the fact that in some of Roy Taylor's research, he was able to notice that folks who had type 2 diabetes for 4 years or less, when they did the sort of very low calorie diet intervention that he provides, which is like 8 to 12 weeks of 800 calories.
It's like meal replacements, just all the way through.
And the rationale for that is to get a huge calorie deficit and reduce the amount of visceral fat, the hepatic fat, the pancreatic fat. And in doing so, you restore insulin sensitivity in the liver, you restore beta cell function, and hopefully the downstream effect of that is better blood glucose control. But what he found was the sort of chance of someone going into remission was very much determined or could be predicted by how long they had type 2 diabetes for. So if you had type 2 diabetes for a long time, 10 years or more, much fewer people would go into remission. And the theory there is that there is more beta cell sort of damage dysfunction that occurs over time beyond repair. And so I was thinking, and Thomas kind of threw this out there, that I can see the utility of a low carb diet in the case of that person who just cannot restore beta cell function, which means they can't get back to producing insulin. Again, in the context of they're having trouble with their management of exogenous insulin, because that's always an option.
Yeah. And actually something I would just add though, if someone was going to go that low carb approach, I would really emphasize the importance of focusing on unsaturated fats over saturated fats as well, because you don't want to sacrifice the heart health, benefits of, or some of the heart health benefits of managing your blood sugar by increasing your ApoB at the same time, right? Yeah. Ideally you want to have both.
Right. And even insulin sensitivity, if you want to talk about that,
yeah.
There's plenty of data showing that when you swap saturated calories from saturated fat for an equal number of calories from unsaturated fats, you increase insulin sensitivity.
Yeah.
And so it does seem like there's some resistance though from many people in that community to shift the type of fat in the diet from a sort of bias towards saturated fats, butter and fatty cuts of meat, to unsaturated fats, nuts, seeds, fatty fish, etc. Why do you think that bias exists?
I mean, I think part of it is preference. I think it's a lot easier to do a low carb diet in that way than it is to do one that's rich in unsaturated fats. But otherwise,
Is it?
I think it might be. If you're doing keto, I think it's hard to do that on a plant-based diet. It's
possible. I'm
possible.
talking about a sort of Mediterranean ketogenic diet with olive oil and fatty fish and nuts and seeds and avocado.
That's a good point. With fish and stuff too, it would be a lot easier than like a strictly plant-based approach, and it would certainly be more comparable to what people are currently doing. It's just be replacing the things like the butter and the meat with more of the fish and the olive oil and whatnot. So yeah, I could see that.
I don't want to just pick on one diet here. Yeah. So let's switch sides here for a moment. True or false? A low-fat vegan diet is the optimal way to do a plant-based diet.
I would generally say false. I think some people might do better that way. They might prefer it. Maybe they have an easier time with it, or just feel better. That's fine. But generally speaking, I don't see any reason to consider that optimal or to do that over a more, say, moderate fat approach where you're having more nuts, seeds, and oils. At the same time, I think for growing children who I've mentioned, where just calorie density could be an issue and it's harder for them to get enough calories, having more of those oils and higher fat foods can be really beneficial. I think for athletes, I know myself, like if I was doing super low, and I'm not even a huge guy, but if I was doing super low fat, I feel like I'd be eating like crazy. Whereas having some more of those fats in there makes it a lot easier as far as the volume of food you have to eat as well. And I've heard similar from other athletes. So yeah, I would say I wouldn't call it optimal necessarily, but I think some people might do better that way just out of preference.
So let me push back for a moment.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the position of someone who would argue for a low-fat vegan diet. It's not my position.
Okay.
But I'm going to argue their position for a moment. Isn't there data to suggest that fat damages endothelial function and that the best diet for cardiovascular health, which is the leading cause of death, so we should take it seriously, the best diet is a low-fat diet that promotes endothelial health, not dysfunction, and has been shown in clinical trials to reverse cardiovascular disease.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So we'll take it one at a time. As far as the oil and endothelial function, so where that largely stems from is there was one trial where they took participants, they measured flow-mediated dilation. And how they did that was they essentially put on like a blood pressure cuff, pumped it up, held it there, I think for like 5 minutes or so. And then they released it and saw how well the arteries dilated. Now, the participants were first given oil, and it was something like a 1/4 cup or so of oil. And I believe it was with bread. So it wasn't even just oil alone. So this was a lot of oil with some carbohydrates as well. And they measured then the ability of the arteries to dilate, immediately and shortly thereafter after the meal. And there was some impairment relative to not having had that meal. And from that, the conclusion is then, well, it's crippling the arteries is the word that's often used, and it's not able to open up and allow blood flow. And there are a couple kind of problems with that. For one, and it was olive oil, I'll mention. But for one, they were like that postprandial, post-meal state, having any sort of endothelial function in that state has never actually been shown to translate to higher risk of cardiovascular disease. That's just pure speculation at this point, that would lead to a higher risk of having a cardiac event. Second, when we look at the impact of, say, olive oil consumption on fasting level or fasting ability of the arteries to dilate, so flow-mediated dilation in the morning, it actually improves function. So an argument can be made for olive oil actually improving artery function in the case that's actually been shown to protect against cardiovascular disease, which is those kind of baseline fasting levels.
What do you think? Is that the polyphenols?
I think it could be. I think that makes sense. And I also wonder if replacement matters a bit. Mind you, in that study, they did do a subgroup analysis based on what was being replaced. And it seemed to be pretty consistent regardless of replacement. It was even similar to omega-3 fats, which is really interesting, which I thought might even be preferable. So it could be polyphenols. It could be a few things.
If you take the acute endothelial cell function following olive oil, and then you apply
a large dose with bread,
right? And so you could come to the same conclusions if you were assessing how exercise also affects endothelium.
I was just gonna make that comparison, because exercise can trigger inflammation post-meal or post-workout as well, and it can last that way for even 2 days depending on the intensity.
So that really illustrates, if you look at something in isolation.
Yeah.
So theoretically, we could be very reductionist, zoom right in on exercise. I could get you to go and run, measure inflammation or endothelial cell function, showing increase in inflammation, reduction in flow-mediated dilation, and without knowing any other information, I could on paper say exercise is going to be bad for cardiovascular health.
Yeah, I've made that comparison on my Instagram as well a few times, just because I think it really illustrates the point, because I don't think there's any debate around the benefits of exercise at this point. So yeah, it is very reductionist.
Okay, and what about the claims of reversing cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, so those stem from a couple places. So there's the lifestyle heart trial. So this was the randomized trial by Dr. Dean Ornish. It's been now, I think, 3 decades since that. So it's been around for
1990.
Yeah. So it's been about that. So what they did was they took, I think it was 28 participants with coronary artery disease. So they had angiograms showing coronary artery disease, and they then randomized them to an intervention or a control group. So in the intervention group, they were put on a low-fat vegetarian diet. Now, the vegans always cite this as a vegan diet. It wasn't. They were allowed to have egg whites, and they were allowed to have some low-fat dairy. So it was not strictly vegan. They were also having a B12 supplement. They were walking primarily for exercise. They were attending support groups, and then smoking cessation was a part of the protocol as well, but only one participant actually smoked at baseline. So I don't think smoking had a huge effect one way or another. And then the control group underwent standard care. Now they measured, they essentially measured the amount of plaque in the arteries at the beginning and then after the trial, and they noted some regression. Now the issue with that is that the type of measurement they used was not gold standard, and for that measurement, there's a certain threshold value of difference you need to see. Right, so you need to see at least a certain amount of a decrease in plaque size, so to speak, in order to say that there was some reversal, and it didn't meet that threshold.
When you say it's not gold standard, just to be clear, it's not gold standard today, or at the time it wasn't gold standard?
So definitely not today. Now, this is a little outside my wheelhouse, but I believe some of these limitations were at least known then. Whether or not there were better methods, I'm not sure. But some of the limitations were noted at that time. So it could go either way. I won't say with a lot of confidence either way on that. But basically, it didn't meet that threshold for regression. And so it could just be due to margin of error measurement. Another thing that's noted is actually the reference artery. So you have the plaque, the artery, and you have plaque blocking a part of it. And you're kind of looking at how much of the space the plaque is blocking. And what they noted was there was actually a wider space So it could be the case the artery actually dilated and the plaque stayed the same. Like that's another way to potentially look at it. There are a lot of potential variables there. So it wasn't, oh, sorry, I knocked the mic. So it wasn't just
those biceps.
Yeah, oh man, it's just
Gold's
workout this morning
has you pumped up, and we're hitting microphones.
Yeah. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. But yeah, so it wasn't a vegan diet, even though it's often cited in favor of a vegan diet. It wasn't just diet. It was a multifactorial intervention. It didn't meet the threshold that it needed to meet to claim that there was reversal. And we now have better ways to measure these things. And actually more recently, the CardioPrev trial, which compared a Mediterranean diet higher in fat versus a low fat diet, again, not a strictly low fat vegan diet, but a low fat and pretty healthy diet based on what they were eating. And that found that there was actually some regression in the Mediterranean diet group that was higher in fat. So
unsaturated fats.
Yeah, unsaturated fat in particular. And so that is another reason to push back on the claim that it's like the only diet that's shown this sort of effect, because it's not.
And they had significantly less events as well in CardioPrev.
Yeah, and I think that's the big takeaway from the Ornish trial as well, is that at the 5-year follow-up, the control group had like 2.5 times the events.
Yeah, so this is a very important point, because someone might think you're sort of trashing on that study. No. You're more talking about the interpretation of that. So by definition and by the study design, we cannot determine the independent effects of diet in that study, period, because there was it exercise? And there was a little bit of smoking cessation.
Yeah. Support groups.
So there's a bunch of different things within the intervention that could be affecting the outcomes. So that's the first, I think, that I'm just kind of feeding back to you what you said. Yeah. But that's the first thing that stops you saying a vegan diet reversed it. And then the second is the imaging. But what you're saying is it probably doesn't matter too much. Who cares?
Yeah.
Because that intervention did lead to a significant reduction in cardiovascular events.
Exactly. And that's what I care about. I don't care if one marker improves or even gets worse if you end up having a lower risk of disease. Like that's what I care about, is do you have a lower risk of having a heart attack or a stroke or whatever it may be? And if that's the case, then great. That's what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. What about the Dr. Esselstyn study? That often gets cited as well.
So that was a case series, and they had 198, I believe, participants. And this was over time, who had previously had heart disease, and he enrolled them in their program, went on a strictly low-fat, plant-based. This one, I believe, was strictly plant-based. Some of the participants, I can't recall the exact proportions, were on cholesterol-lowering medication as well, so they weren't just doing the diet. That's something that often gets left out. And they were followed for a period of up to a few years. I can't recall the exact follow-up time. But basically, they found that they had the people who stuck with the program long-term had a much lower risk of having a cardiovascular event than those who fell off the program. Now, there are multiple variables there because, well, for one, this wasn't a randomized controlled trial to begin with. They were all enrolled and they were comparing people who stuck with it versus people who didn't stick with it. Now, people who didn't stick with it probably aren't as healthy in other factors as well. Maybe they aren't exercising as much and doing other things as well. But at the end of the day, they saw a much lower risk. And that's great. It's some evidence. It's not the highest quality evidence. We have better evidence out there. But what often gets cited is there's one angiogram, one image of an artery of a before and after. And you see that, apparently the artery just opened up, right? The plaque kind of melted away, so to speak. And if that is the case, I mean, I know I've heard of other cases from cardiologists where this sort of thing does happen on occasion and they don't know exactly why. But the other thing is, even if you were to take that image from a slightly different angle, it can appear as though it's a completely new artery, right? So it could just depend on the imaging because these are done, a year plus apart. So that's a possibility. And at the end of the day, it was one individual out of the 198 that this image is from. So I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that either. But again, at the end of the day, we know by even better data than that it lowers your risk of having a heart attack. So it doesn't matter. We don't need to sell it on this, image that they had in there. We can just sell it on the fact that consistently, we see that people eating plant-based diets, whether strictly plant-based or mostly plant-based, have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And that's what we should care about.
And what would you say to someone who's interested in prevention, so primary prevention versus secondary prevention? So a number of these trials, like the Dean Ornish one, the CardioPrev and Leon, are all secondary prevention. So they're looking at how does a dietary intervention affect cardiovascular disease in the context of someone having existing cardiovascular disease, whereas the other, and I think you've made it clear there what the evidence sort of shows.
Yeah.
The other question is, what about preventing the disease from occurring in the first place? Is it the exact same sort of principles?
The same principles apply for the most part. And we have some evidence. As far as observational research, we have quite a bit. As far as randomized trials, like long-term randomized trials, we don't have a ton. We have things like the PREDIMED study that found a Mediterranean diet, whether it's rich in nuts or olive oil, could lower risk of cardiovascular events by quite a bit as well. But yeah, generally speaking, we see that each of these individual components of a healthy diet that I talked about seem to lower risk, even in primary prevention. And overall dietary patterns, Mediterranean diet scores, healthy plant-based diet index scores, which is basically scoring your diet according to how many healthy plants you eat. And then you get kind of negative points for animal foods and the less healthy plant foods. Those with the highest scores versus the lowest have a much lower risk of cardiovascular disease in the first place. And this is consistent, amongst all the different dietary patterns of almost all the major cohorts that we have this data on.
I think it's another scenario where it seems like it's difficult for some people to accept that there might be a few different ways of going about this, right?
Yeah, it could be.
What if you were adopting a low-fat vegan diet, and there are probably people listening to this that have had great results doing that, what would you want to draw their attention to? Where are the potential blind spots of a low-fat vegan diet, things that they could keep an eye on to optimize within that variation that they choose?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So at least in the trials that have been done, like Dr. Neil Bernard's trials with diabetes, I think protein intake tends to be suboptimal, tends to be quite low. So one thing I would emphasize are things like legumes, tofu, hopefully not so low fat that you're avoiding tofu as well, but legumes, tofu, even considering a protein powder to help up the protein intake.
What do you think about the idea as someone gets older and let's say they have lower appetite and they're following a plant-based diet, slowly adjusting some of their calories so they're getting a little bit less calories from, say, whole grains and starches and more calories from the legume food group?
I think that's fine. I think, as long as you're eating a nutritionally adequate diet, as long as you're still consuming some, a couple servings of those foods, I don't think you need to maximize intake of them. I think it is probably more important to resistance train, to eat those legumes for their nutrient density and protein, because it is your main protein source in that sort of a diet. And I think that can be totally suitable. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Why the concern with low protein? From a health point of view, what are you concerned by? What do you think increasing protein will help protect someone against?
So, one of the issues with aging is that we just absorb less protein to begin with. So we have issues absorbing as much, which is why some experts will recommend higher protein intake as we age. And then for, helping prevent things like sarcopenia, along with resistance training, that is the takeaway, is that resistance training is number one, protein second to that. So resistance training, helping maintain bone mineral density, particularly in that at-risk population, especially postmenopausal women. That's one of the areas where we've seen the biggest effects. That would be the reason, is just to help maintain mobility, quality of life, reduce risk of frailty. And then we also have a meta-analysis from a couple of years ago, looking at, it was 31 cohorts, over 700,000 participants or something along those, it might have been even more, looking at protein intake and mortality, and the highest protein intake, and specifically highest plant protein intake, was associated with a lower risk of mortality relative to lower intakes. And so I think we have a good reason to emphasize protein intake, especially in those people who are at risk of consuming too little, which would be those eating a low-fat plant-based diet.
The resistance training piece, I find very interesting. I think we've spoken about this before, but there does seem to be, at the moment, a real, and I appreciate the importance of protein. I think it's important. But there seems to be this kind of obsession with protein, particularly animal protein, and a common theme or rhetoric that I see currently is around falls, and falls being, I think there have been claims, people saying it's the number one cause of death, people age 65 and over.
Yeah. So if we're doing true or false, I'll say false. And that's because where that comes from is, at least where we've traced it back to, is so according to the CDC or World Health Organization?
CDC.
Yeah, that was the CDC data we were talking about. So according to the CDC, the number one cause of death was cardiovascular disease. Then unintentional injuries made up 2.7% of the total risk of death or causes of death in that age group. Now, of those unintentional deaths, falls was number one. So it's not that falls were the number one cause of death, period. It was that of that 2.7% of the deaths, it was the number one cause. And so it gets...
Which is super important to understand.
Yeah.
Because as you said, 25% of deaths were cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
Well, that was heart attacks, actually.
It was heart attacks specifically.
When you add in stroke, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, and cancer, it's over 50%.
Yeah.
But this becomes important when you're thinking about your food selection, because if you're making the claim that falls are the number one cause of death in people aged over 65, and then you're assuming that the primary reason people are having falls and breaking bones is because of a lack of protein, well, that could be argued on its own, because there are a number of contributors, right?
Yeah.
One being
medications,
sedentary lifestyle,
vision, like all sorts of,
what someone could be making a decision to include, say, more animal foods in their diet to negate the effect of falls, while at the same time worsening their cardiometabolic health risk, which is what they're most likely going to die of.
Yeah, I know that's the big problem, and it's always specific to like promoting the animal protein as well. It's always like you need the animal protein to prevent your risk of falls, and yeah.
How much protein is optimal, and what's suboptimal?
So I would say a good target, and I'm open to this shifting a little bit depending on evidence, if better evidence comes out, but I tend to focus on about 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. I think especially in that older age group, that's a really good target, and I think it's also great to start building those habits earlier on and to aim for that sort of target. While again, resistance training or doing some sort of physical activity is going to be great to do on top of that. Suboptimal, certainly below the RDA, I think you're definitely too low, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram. But I would say, anywhere below that 1.2 could potentially be suboptimal relative to that 1.2 plus. And then any benefits you're going to get from 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram are primarily going to be amongst strength athletes and aren't massive. There's something there, and that can add up over, you're training for 10, 15 years, that adds up, but it's not like going to be earth shattering for the average person.
What's that meta-analysis? We'll put it on screen.
Yeah, Tagawa.
With the two
last
graphs.
Year.
And it makes it really clear that when it comes to strength, like the greatest stimulus, but you can eat as much protein as you want, but if the resistance training is not there, you're not getting much increase in strength. Yeah,
and so that was for the figures, if you have it on the screen here, on the right side was for protein without resistance training. And it's like this tiny bump in it was like lean mass, right? Just tiny bump in that. Whereas on the left side where you have it with resistance training, you see that it's like way up here where just resistance training alone was great. And then as you go from the low protein to high protein, you see further, improvements.
Yeah. And the other very notable observation, which comes back, so you were talking about 1.2 grams per kilogram. When you look in the context of people doing resistance training, so by far resistance training clearly is the most important stimulus here. And then what's interesting is if you compare 1.2 grams per kilo to say 1.6, and there's a lot of argument over these numbers online, that's really just like squeezing the last bit of water out of the towel. Right, the sort of greatest magnitude of effect comes from adding resistance training.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think there's any debate around that.
True or false? Most people should avoid gluten. Gluten is inflammatory and it causes leaky gut. otherwise known as intestinal permeability?
So I say false. Now, there is about 1% of the population. It'll vary a little bit depending on the population, but we'll say roughly 1% of the population who has celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition that can be dangerous, can even be life-threatening if you're consuming gluten. So in those cases, if you're having gut issues, one of the first things you'll often be tested for on your blood test is a marker called TTG, tissue transglutaminase, which is testing for one of the antibodies that's present in celiac disease. So you test for that. Rule it in or rule it out to figure that out. And if it isn't celiac, then that's probably not a problem. Now, there's also another, we'll say roughly 6% of the population. There are different estimates. I'll give you the link to this particular paper that cites about 6% of the population who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So it's not that celiac disease, it's not life-threatening, but this can lead to gut symptoms and things like that just aren't comfortable. And in that group of individuals as well, avoiding gluten might be beneficial. But then for the over 90% of the population who don't have either of those issues, there's just no good reason to avoid gluten. And in fact, gluten-free diets have been associated with a high risk of type 2 diabetes in the, I think that was the Nurses' Health and Health Professionals follow-up studies as well. So, and that's probably because when you're eating gluten-free, you tend to eat more of the refined, less of the whole grain carbohydrates, because a lot of the gluten-free products are made from the refined grains as well, and whole grains can be protective.
We can't talk about gluten without talking about lectins, can we? Lectins certainly gets a lot of airtime since Plant Paradox, I think.
Yeah.
Paradox certainly was a New York Times best-selling book, I think. It's become a household name, and one of this, I guess, the thesis of the book is that lectins are causing leaky gut again, and as a consequence leads to inflammation and all of these different inflammatory related conditions. So true or false, lectins cause leaky gut?
False. I don't even know where that claim can come from. I've never actually heard that specific claim. It's usually about lectins poisoning us or being toxic. But yeah, the one thing about lectins, though, to understand is that lectins are most concentrated in certain plant foods like legumes in particular, and especially the lectins that could potentially be toxic are concentrated in certain legumes like kidney beans. The thing is, when we cook them, you destroy the lectins to the point that they're not even detectable. And it doesn't take a lot of cooking either. And so if you're cooking legumes to the point that they're actually edible, so they're soft, that you're going to eat them, then the lectins are destroyed anyway. And if you're buying canned, they're already cooked, so it's already taken care of. So really, it's just an issue of improperly prepared legumes. And there are some cases of raw kidney bean poisoning where they're undercooked or raw. There was one analysis from the UK over 13 years. There were 50 reported suspected, not even confirmed, cases of lectin poisoning. And one argument I've heard recently that I thought was just awesome, so I want to bring it up, is that this is an issue of improperly prepared food, legumes, and it's often coming from more of the animal-based diet crowd. Well, what's the risk of improperly prepared meat? Right? If we look at the UK again, in 2014, there was an analysis that found in a single year, poultry alone was responsible for 250,000 cases of foodborne illnesses and 1,000 hospitalizations. If we look at US data, salmonella from poultry alone, so forget about other foodborne illnesses, but just salmonella is responsible for almost 100 deaths per year. Why not point in that direction if you're going to talk about this, specific case of not preparing your food properly? Whereas in reality, legume consumption, if you look at, any of the recent, there's a couple meta-analyses that have come out in the last couple of years, one looking at cardiovascular disease and one looking at total mortality, and both found that higher legume consumption is associated with a lower risk.
So do people need to use a pressure cooker, or are their canned beans okay?
Canned is okay. Canned gets rid of the lectins anyway. It's already been cooked. It's already been taken care of. You don't have to worry about it. Even boiling, you don't have to worry about it if you're boiling to the point that they're soft again. You squish it with a fork. That's the point where you're going to be eating it. The lectins won't be there anymore.
Well, it's a pretty easy test.
Yeah.
Think about the texture.
Yeah.
I think you'd know if you were having an uncooked bean.
I know. I don't think it'd be very pleasant.
No, don't try that. All right, Dr. Nagra, this has been Excellent. Thank you again for sitting down with me. I know that the audience is very appreciative of your time and everything that you're doing. You haven't finished your milk, so
I will finish it.
You will finish it. I'll make you finish it. And thanks for doing this, and hopefully we can do it again sometime soon. Continue the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's good to finally connect in person after 2 years of talking almost every day.
1,000, more than 1,000. How many messages do you think we've had?
I don't know. It's going on 30 a day probably. I don't know. It's a lot.
And it's WhatsApp, it's Twitter, it's Instagram. It's too hard to keep up.
Yeah.
Thanks, dude. There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.